be here, Jack. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to Stephanie, and thank you everybody listening, and thank you everybody who's been talking to your hard acts to follow. In fact, so hard to follow that because I found myself becoming so absorbed in what you were saying, that when I combine that with my natural preference for writing, not talking, I've realized that I'm facing some obstacles in the next 15 minutes, but here goes. As you say, Jack, my book recently published, or at least about to be published this week, is a memoir. But in fact, it's not the first memoir that I've written. And this is where I should begin, I think, by saying that in 2006, I published a book about my childhood called In the Blood, which takes the story, if story is quite the word for it, of my life from the age of nothing to 17, at which point in my life, my mother suffered a very serious accident, which, because it was so serious, acted as a kind of bookend for that part of my life. And ever since I finished that book now, many years ago, I've been toying with the idea of writing a sequel to it and bringing the story up to date. But I realized every time I tried to do such a thing that the procedures that had served me in the first instance probably wouldn't work very well second time round. And in particular, what I found myself thinking was that whereas I'd written the first book in the historic present, so as to give a kind of freshness to what I was writing about, as though in some sense my childhood was still happening to me, that method wouldn't really work for a description of adult life or a representation of adult life. The advantage I hoped with the method was that in the first book, it allowed for a kind of intimacy, as I say, but the cost of that intimacy was to deny me the room, the space in which to reflect. I was simply immersed in this series of moments. I didn't feel that that was an appropriate way to write about my later life, not so much because I felt that I had a thesis to develop or an argument to follow. I rather didn't have any of those things, but because I thought that that kind of lack of self-awareness implied by what I've said about the first book would be something that looked approximately like deceit or avoidance in the second book. So after throwing away about 100 pages of efforts at beginning this second book, Sleeping on Islands, considering for quite a long time whether to put it in the third person in order to give myself a kind of objective stance, rejecting that because it seemed too confusing and also too cold. I plunged in, writing the book in a series of short scenes, some of which I hope approximate to the condition of prose poems, but some of them more narrative driven, rather like the relationship, in fact, between aria and recitative in opera. That was the idea roughly in my mind. So no historic present, just a retrieval of the past, and these, as I say, these short scenes. It begins more or less at the point where In the Blood, the previous book gave up, which is to say there's a short account of the end of my life at home. I was brought up in what was then rural Essex. My father was a brewer. My mother didn't go out to work and was so often ill even before her accident that she wouldn't have found it at all easy to hold down a job, I don't think, in a permanent way. It was a happy childhood apart from the things that were happening to my mum, but it was also one in which there were no, or next to no, books. It was simply not my parents' interest to read, and there was absolutely no expectation that my own life would end up having so much to do with books. My father used to claim that he'd read half a book in his life, and I know what it was. It was a so-called thriller. Somebody must have told him it was a thriller, but it was obviously not very thrilling to him since he only read half of it. A so-called thriller called The Lonely Skier by Hammond Innes. I remember my father bringing it on holiday for several years, actually, and impatiently flicking over the pages while it rained and then gratefully throwing it aside when the rain stopped. My mother read a little bit more than that when she was able to. I think she was a member of a book club. I remember her fishing, as it were, the new Iris Murdoch out of jiffy bags. So there were books around, but as I say, this was not a priority or a particular interest. They thought of themselves as country people doing country things, which in their case didn't include reading. In the corner of the sitting room, there was a device which we call the whirligig. Perhaps they really are called whirligigs, which was a kind of rotating bookcase, which had the books some of the books that they didn't read as stored in it. And one of them, because I think it was a school prize of my mother's, was the collected poems of Rupert Brooke, an unfashionable figure these days and not that fashionable at the time, but I was aware of that book. And in particular, I was aware of the rather glamorous photograph taken by Shell of him not wearing a shirt with his floppy fair hair at the beginning of the book. And it gave me, when I opened it, an idea of poetry being a rather sort of glamorous thing, but I left it at that, really. And then at the beginning of my A-level time at school, I fell under the spell of an absolutely wonderful, genius English teacher, a man called Peter Way, who walked very briskly into my mind and turned the lights on, made poems seem things which were part of life or could be part of life rather than weird additions to them, rather than simply sort of fancy ornaments. At which point the spectre of Rupert Brooke concentrated a little bit in my mind. And in my last summer holidays from school, and this is precisely the point at which this book begins, two friends and I went to look for Rupert Brooke's grave, which is on the island of Skyros as part of Greece. And the reason that he's buried there is that he died on the way to Gallipoli, where he would almost certainly have been killed had he not died en route. And a little boat was put down from the big boat on which he was traveling. And some friends of his in his regiment rowed him ashore, walked the body up the dry riverbed, which they found at their point of landing, and buried him in an olive grove. So these two friends and I set off overland. We took the train to Athens. We were, 17 years old? Took the train to Athens, took buses across and boats across to Skyros, and then walked to look for the grave, very nearly dying in the attempt, I must say, because we were so ill-prepared. When we got back to school, we boastfully put on a little talk with slides of our, as we thought of it, great adventure. And to that talk came not only the English teacher that I've mentioned and want to praise, but also the recently arrived headmaster of the school, a man called Dennis Silk, who was really more of a games player than an intellectual, as I think he would have admitted himself. And as part of his games playing life, he'd become friendly with Siegfried Sassoon, the First World War poet, then a very old man, of course, because Dennis Silk was a very good cricketer and Sassoon loved cricket, and they'd become friends through cricket. And through his friendship with Sassoon, dead by this time, Dennis wondered whether I'd like to meet a friend of Sassoon's called Geoffrey Keynes, Maynard's brother, Geoffrey, then also a very old man living just outside Cambridge, because Geoffrey had been a friend of Rupert Brooke's at school, and Dennis thought that it would be nice for me to go and talk to him about the condition of Brooke's grave and generally share my enthusiasm. And so I did. And because it turned out that Geoffrey lived quite near where my father was then living, it was easy for me to go and see him during the school holidays, which I began to do. And even though Geoffrey was 60 years older than me, I think, we became good friends. And really through his kindness and his extraordinary willingness to share the treasures that were heaped up in his house, paintings, books, conversation, I began to feel that a door was opening into the life that I, in the most sort of tentative way, was beginning to feel might be the one that I wanted to lead instead of the one that I'd been born into. So when the time came to go to university, I thought that English is what I would study at university. And I should perhaps say that nobody in my father's family anyway had been to university before, so this had a kind of a shock and novelty, sense of adventure value to it, for me at least. When I got to university, I read as voraciously as I possibly could. I felt, as I still feel, that I had a lot to make up for in terms of lost time. And one of the poets that I was spending a lot of time reading then was the great Northern Irish poet Louis MacNeice. And when I discovered that Louis MacNeice's long-term friend, E.R. Dodds, Eric Dodds, author of The Greeks and the Irrational, was still alive and living just outside Oxford with the brass neck of youth, I wrote to him and asked whether I could go and see him. And a friend and I did go and see him, and then we became friends. And through Dodds, I met, in the very last part of his life, W.H. Auden, who had returned to Oxford at least for some of the last year of his life, because by that stage in his own existence needed a bit of looking after. And Auden was kind to me, and we made an arrangement, he made an arrangement with me that once a week through the fall of that year, which was the year before he died, I would take new poems and show them to him, and we would sit and talk about them, and so we did. And I've talked a little bit about that in the book. It seemed to me, and perhaps this is a theme that emerges through the book, that though I wouldn't have put it to myself like this at the time, that I was somebody who needed to move quite a long way from where I was born in order to be where I wanted to get, and that having mentors of a kind that I could admire and follow in a more or less unqualified way would help me make that transition. And Auden's kindness to me was a very important thing for me, in a sense of giving me permission as well as being inspiring. When I finished my time at university, I stayed at Oxford for a couple of years and did research on the poet Edward Thomas, who I was and am very keen on. And then it was time that I got my first job, and a job happened to come up at the University of Hull, where, as many of you listening know, for the last 30 years of his life, the university librarian was Philip Larkin. This was certainly an incentive for me to apply for a job in Hull, though of course Larkin did have the reputation of living very firmly as a hermit, so it never seemed very likely that we'd become friends, but against the run of play we did. And actually I think I have my father to thank for this, at least in the first instance, because Philip and I first met in the university staff bar in the days when people used to drink at lunchtime. And we were drinking beer, and which I never saw him do again. Philip took a huge swig of beer at some early point in our rather stilted conversation, and it went down the wrong way. So this person that I so looked up to, I was suddenly having to pound on the back and help him to get over his beer having gone down the wrong way, which in itself was a sort of oddly intimate way of being with him. And when he recovered from his coughing and spluttering, he began to ask me about my life and said, "What does your father do?" And I said that my father was a brewer. And I remember, and will until my own dying day, Philip's eyes lighting up and him saying, "A brewer," as though he decided on that evidence that I came from stock, which was worth bothering with, since it produced alcohol, rather than having anything to do with writing, which after all you can take or leave as you like. Anyway, I worked in Hull for 3 years, and then I went back to Oxford. I took over as editor of the Poetry Review after living there for a couple of years, catching up with my writing. And then I went to work for the publishers Chatto and Windus. And at some point in this period, Philip came to see me in Oxford and asked me to become one of his literary executors, which I did, though wishing that he wouldn't die and expecting to have a very long period of not having to do any executive work. But as everybody knows, he died young, actually, even though he's had a rather valetudinarian manner in 1985. And then I set about writing his biography, encouraged to do this, in fact, asked to do this by his relic, Monica Jones, the dedicatee of his book, The Less Deceived. An extraordinary opportunity for me, though, of course, since I was fond of Philip and missed him, not one that I particularly wanted to take. I had written a biography of a family called Lambert up to that, but before that point, but really writing about Philip was a different order of things. and required an enormous range of different ways of thinking to be brought together: philosophizing, literary scholarship, curiosity and sympathy with as many people as I could get to see, which was pretty much everybody that he knew as far as I was aware. And by the time my book came out, his reputation had changed rather, complicated a great deal, from being the nation's sort of favorite teddy bear poet to being somebody who, because of his views, was a much more complicated figure. I followed that book by writing about John Keats, and I've written a little bit about that in my book as well. And at some point after that, in 1995, I was appointed Poet Laureate. I split the job into two parts in my mind's eye. I split it into a doing part and a writing part. The doing part really consisted of setting up the poetry archive, which Jack was talking about. I wanted to leave a rock in the road behind me. I'd agreed to do it for 10 years, and I wanted to leave a rock in the road that would outlive my tenure. And the other bit was the writing bit, of course, which by precedent required me to write poems about events in the royal calendar, something that I've made no secret of finding very difficult to do because, well, for a variety of reasons, one of them being that my poems depend on having very strong feelings about the things that I'm writing about, and with the best will in the world, I was suddenly required to write about people that I'd never met and in many cases never did meet. So that was a complicated part of the job. When I stood down as laureate, I took on too many other things that of a sort of public nature for my own peace of mind. And then the opportunity came to come and teach at Johns Hopkins here in Baltimore, where I'm talking from now. T.S. Eliot says in one of the four quartets that old men ought to be explorers. I was 62, I think, when I came here. My wife and I simply put all our belongings in a gigantic metal container and sailed them across the Atlantic. It seems in hindsight a slightly braver thing to do than it felt at the time. I think I was so excited when we first moved here by the thought of coming that I didn't realize how bold / reckless a move it was. But I think it was one of the, in fact, I know it was one of the best things I've ever done in my life. It's allowed me much more time for my own work, which I'm very glad to have. And it's allowed me to stand under the great Niagaran downpour of American poetry, which I hope is introducing my own writing to new influences, new things. So I miss my friends very much. I miss my family very much, and my children and their children especially, but I'm very glad to be here. And in fact, I've recently become an American citizen, a dual citizen with my British nationality. So I can't see myself leaving here in a hurry. So I suppose if I'm spared, there may be a third book in this What Happened to Me series, but for the time being, we're stuck at part 2. Thank you for listening to me.